If everything we project onto reality to make it intelligible were eliminated, no things remain but only dynamic quanta in relation of tension to all other dynamic quanta. Their essence lies in their relation to all other quanta, in their effect upon the same. Thus, for Nietzsche, the world is essentially a world of relationships. The late Nachlass does not give us a good sense of the reasons Nietzsche has for endorsing a relational ontology. Instead, it seems that Nietzsche himself is engaged in a priori speculation about fundamental reality. Where did you get these claims about the nature of reality? It is here, however, that the connection between the relational ontology found in the late Nachlass and the understanding of Heraclitus Nietzsche first articulates in his 1873 unpublished work, Philosophy and the Tragic Age of the Greeks, can help address these concerns. If you're interested in the kind of fundamental kind of core of Nietzsche's thinking, on my view, you go to this unpublished book, Philosophy and the Tragic Age of the Greeks. First, the relational ontology Nietzsche attributes to Heraclitus is divorced from any notion of the will to power. Second, Nietzsche eventually turns to the natural sciences of his day to justify what comes to be his own commitment to a Heraclitean ontology and to re-articulate this ontology in the scientific language of force. Finally, Nietzsche's early interest in Heraclitus' relational ontology reveals the way in which it informs many of the claims Nietzsche puts forth in the subsequent published works. In Philosophy and the Tragic Age of the Greeks, Nietzsche credits Heraclitus with repudiating both the appearance-reality distinction that emerged in the thought of Anaximander and the concept of being more generally. Becoming is what Nietzsche's Heraclitus sees, and becoming entails the rejection of both metaphysical things in themselves and common sense things. Although it is initially difficult to understand why becoming, a thesis about change, especially if you say everything changes, well, isn't there a thing built into that notion, should entail the rejection of things, some clarity begins to emerge once we see that Nietzsche grounds Heraclitean becoming in an even more fundamental principle, namely the unity of opposites. For Nietzsche, Heraclitus' doctrine of the unity of opposites states that reality at the fundamental level is composed of opposites that exist only insofar as they stand in relation to each other. In other words, Nietzsche's Heraclitus thinks that reality at the fundamental level is entangled. So I'm reading this idea of the unity of opposites as a claim about entanglement way back in Heraclitus. I know that conflicts with some contemporary understandings of what the unity of opposites is about. And this entanglement explains why change is a necessary feature of nature. To develop these points, Nietzsche follows Schopenhauer in arguing that everything in space and time, as well as space and time themselves, has only relative existence. From this, Nietzsche argues that we can move on to the Heraclitean conclusion that the nature of reality, Wirklichkeit, this does work out well in the German, is nothing other than its manifestations or effects, its Wirken. Because the being of the material world lies in its activity, it is necessary for these beings continually to affect or be affected by each other. Change or becoming is therefore an essential feature of reality because the fundamental constituents of reality must be manifesting themselves at all times, and they can only manifest themselves in relation to other entities. In other words, I think Heraclitean becoming is a form of actualism, and this actualism goes hand in hand with this relational ontology. Not to act is not to exist. Although Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks provides substantive reasons for linking the relational ontology found in Nietzsche's later Nachlass to his early interpretation of Heraclitus, the work itself provides only indirect evidence that Nietzsche endorses the views he attributes to Heraclitus. However, we know from other texts from this time that Nietzsche turns to the results of the natural sciences to justify a commitment to this Heraclitean ontology. Most notably, in an unpublished lectures from the early 1870s, printed in a book now called The Pre-Platonic Philosophers, Nietzsche appeals to the work of Hermann von Helmholtz and Karl Ernst von Baer to argue that the natural sciences of his day prove the Heraclitean view, and this is number 4, the Heraclitean view that all things flow. That's their main proposition. As Nietzsche explained, nowhere does an absolute persistence exist because we come in the final analysis to forces. In my book, I argue that Nietzsche's early reflections on pre-Socratic philosophy are significant because they provide a bridge to understanding his reflections on first and last things in his first book, or his book published in 1878, Human All Too Human. There, Nietzsche embraces, more so than in any other work, the ethos and the results of scientific investigation to reject both metaphysical and common sense descriptions of reality. He begins by referring to, and this is really this is hard to convince people of, but it's the problem of opposites. He says this is the fundamental problem of philosophy. He repeats it twice, also at the beginning of Beyond Good and Evil, if you're familiar with that. And he said it's the same problem that animated philosophy some 2,000 years ago is now animating us again. And he identifies two types of philosophy that emerge depending on how one answers this problem. On the one hand, there's the metaphysical philosophers who strictly divide opposites and they demand separability. And they eventually claim that a phenomena emerge from the realm of things in themselves. So you have things in themselves, and if you have phenomena, then you derive it from the thing in itself. Historical philosophy, which Nietzsche claims cannot be separated from the natural sciences, so he aligns the natural sciences with this, denies that opposites can strictly be separated. Thus, I would say he's endorsing a form of entanglement right here, and so rejects the existence of things in themselves. What's clear is that he's wanting to get rid of things in themselves. Having made such a distinction, Nietzsche then endorses historical philosophy and promises to offer in the subsequent chapters of the work what he calls a chemistry of moral, religious, and aesthetic conceptions and sensations. So basically, he then systematically unpacks a critique of all those things, having rejected kind of a metaphysical reality in the very first aphorism. Although not explicit, there are 4 reasons why Nietzsche's historical philosophy can be understood as an endorsement of Heraclitean ontology, and so an attempt to show how the natural sciences support such a view. First, the historical philosopher's denial of absolute opposites resembles Nietzsche's understanding of Heraclitus' union of opposite doctrine from the philosophy and the tragic age of the Greeks. This is just the problem that he places at the center between Heraclitus and Parmenides. Second, Schopenhauer also refers to a historical philosophy that he contrasts with metaphysical speculation and associates with a doctrine of constant becoming. Third, we know that Nietzsche's had a 1888 reworking of this aphorism where he explicitly associates historical philosophy with a radical conception of Heraclitean becoming that does away with the concept of being. And finally, Nietzsche then stakes out this very position in the very next aphorisms, which I don't have quoted here. Whereas the opening aphorism of Human All Too Human make it clear that Nietzsche wants to reject any sort of transcendent entities, further aphorisms in the opening chapter suggest an even more radical denial of any countable things or objects whatsoever. Here's the big doubt. He's denying the idea that unity applies to reality, that there's objects that are called unities. Intimations of this position can be found in Nietzsche's claim that nothing in reality corresponds to the logical notion of identity, even though Nietzsche seems to be a little confused to be speaking of 2 qualitatively identical things, sameness of properties, and then diachronic self-identity or numerical sameness over time. In an aphorism entitled Appearance and the Thing in Itself, Nietzsche further claims that science may gradually enable us to realize that the thing in itself is empty of significance, and so, this is a great Nietzsche line, worthy of Homeric laughter. Nietzsche completes the attack on the existence of things in the section called Number. There he tells us that the laws of numbers are erroneous. They do not correspond to anything in reality. They do not correspond to reality because numbers presuppose the existence of identical things. The problem, however, is that there are no identical things. This is because Nietzsche claims there is no thing. According to Nietzsche, things are fabricated, unities which do not exist. Nietzsche then justifies this claim by appealing to the results of the natural sciences. Just as it is wrong to believe that there are common sense things, it is wrong to believe in the theory of atoms. Although we feel compelled to assume the existence of a thing or a material substratum which is moved, the whole procedure of science has pursued the task of resolving everything thing-like or material into motions. Now, at this point, one might wonder, what is Nietzsche talking about? Well, here's a guess. Nietzsche is appealing here to science to reject the things that populate the common sense and scientific pictures of the world. Although by no means clear, Nietzsche's reference to the developments of the natural sciences in this aphorism seems to have Friedrich Albert Lange's history of materialism in mind. Nietzsche's engagement with the text is complex, but we can reasonably turn to the story Lange tells about the developments of the natural sciences in the chapter Force and Matter from the 1873 edition to help elucidate Nietzsche's remarks in Human All Too Human. There, Lange explains how modern materialism, which he casts as a revival of Democritean atomism, has slowly resolved matter into force ever since Newton introduced force into the mechanistic picture. In Lange's own words, and here I think I'm on 7a, the progress of the sciences has led us more and more to put force in place of matter, and that the increasing exactness of research more and more resolves matter into force. From Nietzsche's perspective, the developments of modern science that Lange describes can be understood as the Greek Enlightenment in reverse. Whereas modern science left behind Aristotle for Democritus, earlier modern science did that. Modern science is now progressing from a Democritean worldview of matter and motion to a Heraclitean world of just motion or force. Interestingly, Lange resists the conclusion that reality is one of interrelated forces only. There's also another figure named Afrikaan Spur that resists this as well, that Nietzsche was reading at the time. Instead, he insists first that just as properties belong to substances and predicates belong to subjects, our mind requires us to think force in relation to matter. Second, he claims that we can nevertheless only know forces through their effects and so their relations to other things. Matter, in contrast, remains completely unknown. Thus, the neo-Kantian Lange endorses what I think is a proto-version of ESR. With the advance of science, we become ever more certain in our knowledge of the relation of things and ever more uncertain as to the subject of these relations. In contrast to Lange, Nietzsche responds to this proto-version of ESR by simply jettisoning the unknown subject of these relations, namely matter, what he thinks is the final remnant of being in the scientific picture. In so doing, he endorses a relational ontology of force that I think is a proto-version of OSR. Nietzsche does this by appealing to the authority of the Jesuit mathematician and physicist Roger Boscovich, one of the figures Lange mentions in his chapter on matter and force in the 1873 edition of his work, and who Nietzsche discovered via Gustav Fechner as early as 1873. In an 1882 letter to his friend, this is kind of getting now into the more mature Nietzsche, Heinrich Koselleck, Nietzsche writes, "If anything has been well refuted, it is the prejudice of matter, and indeed not by an idealist, but by a mathematician, by Boscovich. He and Copernicus are the two greatest opponents of appearances to the eye. Since him, there is no longer any matter, except as a popular simplification. He has thought the atomistic theory through to its end. Gravity is most certainly not a property of matter, simply because there is no matter. Gravity is, like vis inertia, certainly an appearance of force, simply because there is nothing else other than force." Although the view that Nietzsche attributes to Boscovich is probably closer to the view of matter later espoused by Michael Faraday than by Boscovich himself, the letter is significant for at least two reasons. First, Nietzsche explicitly associates Boscovich with Copernicus. This suggests that Nietzsche's opposition to appearances to the eye is not an opposition to empirical evidence as such. Instead, he is claiming that Boscovich follows a Copernican tradition of appealing to refined scientific observation to reject untutored observations and common sense beliefs. Second, even though Nietzsche appeals to Boscovich to reject matter, he nevertheless remains a realist about force. Indeed, Nietzsche claims that there is nothing other than force. The letter is also significant because the dual reference to Boscovich and Copernicus directly parallels Nietzsche's remarks about Boscovich and beyond good and evil. In the 12th aphorism, so now we're into kind of Nietzsche's main works, Nietzsche again refers to both Boscovich and Copernicus' opposition to visual evidence, and he appeals to Boscovich's work to argue that, quote, materialistic atomism is one of the best refuted theories there are. According to Nietzsche, Boscovich has shown us that, quote, nothing stands fast, and so we must abandon our belief in substance, in matter, in the earth residuum, and particle atom. Having rejected atomism in the physical realm, Nietzsche then goes on to critique the atomistic need in the psychic realm by rejecting what he calls soul atomism. Thus, Nietzsche appeals to Boscovich to reject atomism in all its forms. And just as he suggests replacing an atomist conception of the soul with a structuralist one, there's a lot of interesting work being done on this, Nietzsche's drive psychology right now. That is, he calls it a social structure of drives and effects. His rejection of atomism in the physical realm implies a commitment to the structuralist ontology he originally attributes to Heraclitus. Although the relationality of force is only implicit in Nietzsche's appeal to Boscovich's rejection of atomism, we can gather further evidence for such a view by such an understanding of force by both turning to Nietzsche's sources and by considering its relationship to the will to power. So the claim will be here is that forces are necessarily relational, and Nietzsche's working in the context in which Nietzsche is working, we can kind of show that. On the one hand, Mathieu Riccardi has traced Nietzsche's understanding of force back to Kant's definition of force as respectus or relation, so it can be tied back to Kant, and then through the work of Afrikansper and another individual, Otto Kaspari, to argue that forces are necessarily relational and so not substance-like or things in themselves. On the other hand, we know that Nietzsche designs the cosmological formulation of the will to power to complete the victorious concept of force in the physics of his day by ascribing an inner quality or will to it. I'll get to this in a bit. Since Pollner and Riccardi have both argued that the doctrine of the will to power is itself a relational ontology, one in which there are only dynamic quanta, whose essence lies in their relation to all their quanta, the forces that form the basis for the doctrine of the will to power must also be relational.